Hello, students. So today we are beginning our Fundamentals of Music Theory course, and this video is going to be the absolute basics. I'm going to assume no prior knowledge to the subject when I am discussing this, so we are going to be starting from the very beginning, and by the end, you will be able to understand all that is written on this lovely whiteboard here. Okay, so with that said, let's just jump right in. So first thing that we need to understand is a basic concept of the musical alphabet. Unlike the traditional alphabet that we are all familiar with, the musical alphabet is just the letters A through G at the end. Okay? And I'm sure you've all heard the term sharp or flat before, but we don't really know what that means. So a sharp, which is represented by this little number sign, hashtag, whatever you want to call it, means that the pitch is slightly higher than what's the letter actually represents. That'll make more sense later when I show you the piano. But for now, just accept it's a slightly higher pitch than, so A sharp is slightly higher than A. Similarly, A flat is slightly lower than A. So sharps are a bit higher, flats are a bit lower. Okay? And as you can see, there is a sharp and a flat between almost all of these pitches. Okay, you'll notice that between B and C and between E and F, there are no sharps and flats. Okay? As we go through these lessons, you'll notice that sometimes we will refer to E sharp or F flat. For our purposes now, though, let's just say they don't exist. F flat is E, so you're just not going to come across that. The other thing to know is that the alphabet will loop. Okay, so once we've gone through all the way from A flat to G sharp, it starts back over. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and it will just continue infinitely like that. The other thing to know is that sharp and flat can mean the same thing in a sense. So as far as what you hear, A sharp and B flat are equivalent. And I should make this a little bit more clear that the sharp is going to refer to that, and the flat is going to refer to that. So A sharp and B flat are the same. And that's why you'll see here at the beginning, I don't list a sharp up here, but there is a flat, and I do list a sharp here, but there's no flat. That's because G sharp is equivalent to A flat, and I felt that writing sharp over there would be a bit confusing. Okay, so before we go any further, let's make sure that that is all perfectly clear by looking at our keyboard. Okay, what you'll notice, if I can get the glare to vanish, which I might not be able to, but you get the idea. You can kind of see it on the little lips down there. So you notice first that there's this pattern of 3 black keys, 2 black keys, 3 black keys, 2 black keys, and that has to do with our sharps and flats. Let's not worry too much about how to read the piano just yet, but I just want to illustrate that, okay, I'm just going to tell you that this pitch, let's see if I can get that a little bit louder. Sorry. That pitch is A. That's A sharp. So you can hear that A sharp is slightly higher than A. Okay, and this is also B flat. Okay, so A sharp and B flat sound the same. Now, depending on the context of the music we're talking about, you will use one over the other, and again, it depends on the context. There is a right answer to whether you say A sharp or B flat, but for now, don't worry about it. All you need to know is that A sharp and B flat sound the same. Okay? So we have our musical alphabet, we have a basic understanding of these sharps and flats, and now we're ready to take a look at the actual, it's called the grand staff, and this is how you will see the pitches notated. So first thing to notice is that we have a pattern of 5 lines and 4 spaces, and then another pattern of 5 lines and 4 spaces, and we have these strange symbols over to the left. So this symbol here, that's the treble clef, and typically that is going to be used for higher pitched instruments. So a soprano saxophone, actually all saxophones will use the treble clef. Guitars are typically notated in treble clef, a flute would be in treble clef, and this is the bass clef. And that would be something like a bass, for instance, or a tuba, a trombone. Lower instruments will use the bass clef. So basically, the pitches down here are lower than the ones up here. Okay? Now, there are additional clefs, and there are additional symbols you can add to these clefs. But for the purpose of our class and the lesson right now, just worry about these two. If you are a piano player, then first of all, I'm not quite sure why you need to learn what the pitches are if you already play the piano, but I mean, maybe you're just starting. We'll see. Yeah, so this is the grand staff that you will see written out for your piano performance, versus some instruments might take one or the other. A piano, for instance, will take both. Okay, so we're losing the board. Pardon my cut. The whiteboard took a nosedive. So let's talk about how we actually understand the pitches as written on these two clefs. So let's start. People are usually more comfortable with the treble clef, but I'm going to start in the bass clef for now. So the first thing, this pitch right here, it's a little circle in the space between the bottom and second line here. Okay, that is going to be A. Okay, so we're just going to call that A. And this one on the subsequent line is B. And then we have C, D, E. You're going to notice the pattern, F, G, and then like I said, once we get to G, we loop back around to A. Okay? So we can see that if you just remember that this bottom space is A, then you can find all of the subsequent pitches. They just go alphabetically from there. And that is actually the same with the treble clef. We're just going to start somewhere else. So let's ignore these two right now and this one over here, and let's start on this very bottom line. That's going to be E. I'm going to write them up here this time. And then we have F and G, A, B, C. The pattern continues. Notice when we get to G, we loop back around to A. Okay, so the staff is quite easy to read. It's just alphabetical. All you need to do is know where to start. And in the treble clef, the bottom line is E. On the bass clef, the bottom space is A. You could also say that the bottom line is G. That way you are just remembering the bottom line for each one. G in the bass clef, E in the treble clef. But I find it helps people to start on the letter A. So whichever way you feel comfortable with, just know that it's a repeating pattern of the alphabet. So what about these pitches here? They don't seem to exist in either staff, do they? Well, this is why we call it the grand staff. It's because the staff is just a segment of this whole spectrum of musical pitches that we can get. There are pitches that go way below the bass clef and way above the treble clef. And this grand staff is just showing a segment of them. And it's a bit misleading if you think about instruments like the flute versus the trombone, which will use the treble clef and the bass clef respectively, because it makes it seem like those are two individual entities. But really, this is one thing. The grand staff is one thing, and they are connected. Okay, so if this one's A, we can just say that this one is B. And then this line that's kind of floating out in space here, that's called a ledger line, that's going to be C. That's a very special C. We'll get to that later. And then we have D. So we can see that even when we go out into these spaces that exist outside of what is written on the staff, it's the same pattern, the same musical alphabet. Okay, now the only part that's missing from this is the idea of sharps and flats. Where do our sharps and flats exist in this staff? Well, there's no spaces or lines where we could put them in between, so we just write them next to one another. So if I want to write, let's say, C sharp, what I'm going to do is put this little number sign right here in front of the sharp, or in front of the C, excuse me. Or if I want to say E flat, for instance, I'll put it there, a little B, that's your flat symbol. So this staff will contain all of the pitches without any alterations, that is to say without putting sharp or flat. They just stand for their standard letter name, but once you can alter that and you can get all 12 pitches of the octave by adding the little symbols before it. And make sure you put the symbols before it. Oftentimes I'll see students put the symbol right after the actual note, and that isn't right, unfortunately. Okay, so that is basically how you can read this. It's just a pattern of the alphabet. You can start on A down here. If you can remember that this bottom space is A, you can just count up all the way. Now, some of the examples that you see might be one staff or the other, so it's best if you can remember that the bottom line of the treble clef is E and the bottom space is A, or however you want to remember it. Just remember that sometimes you'll see them split up, so unless you want to draw a bass clef below every treble clef, it's a good idea to have an understanding of both individually as well as together. Okay? Now, there are a few patterns we can use to make this a little bit simpler. If you have trouble remembering these, then you might want to use one of these mnemonics I'm going to give you, or you might prefer to just start with the alphabet and count. I find that starting with the alphabet is sort of a more guaranteed way to get the right answer, because you just count in the alphabet and everyone knows how to do that, whereas these mnemonics are sometimes confusing for people, so whatever's easiest for you. They do make it a bit quicker, though. So we'll start with the most common one that people know. If we look at the spaces, E, G, B, D, F, or the lines on the treble clef, excuse me, E, G, B, D, F, people usually use the mnemonic, every good boy does fine. And then if we look at these spaces, they're going to spell F, A, C, and then this top one's E. So face, the spaces spell face, and the lines are every good boy does fine. And a similar one exists for the bass clef. The lines are good boys do fine always, G to A in the lines, and then the spaces A, C, E, G, all cows eat grass. So those are just two mnemonics that people will sometimes use to make this a little bit simpler. Okay, so that basically covers everything we need to know for our general understanding of the grand staff and how to read pitches on it. So I would recommend doing a few exercises with this just to make sure you're comfortable with it, and then we will move on to what happens when we move away from looking at one note at a time and we start looking at two notes at a time.